Hello and welcome back. Today we are continuing our lecture series on the Civil War. And so we're going to pick up with General Grant. General Grant is, the guy that Lincoln really needs to be able to win this war. He understands how the North is gonna win. It's not going to be by outsmarting Lee. It's going to be by overwhelming Lee. And to be able to do that, you've got to be willing to engage in battles where your side loses more men than your enemy. And so far, Union generals just have not been willing to do that. So from our previous lecture, we had left off with Gettysburg, which is going to be a big win for the North. But it's at this point where Lincoln is going to name General Grant the essentially the general in chief, and so he's going to put him in charge of the war effort for the North. He's got a completely different view of how to fight this war than all the other generals. And like I said, it's superiority in numbers and in bullets and guns and in food, and so Lee's strategy is essentially just going to be never back down, keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting, and eventually you're going to wear out your opponent. That is what a war of attrition is all about, and we've talked about that from previous lectures. So when Grant gets put in charge, guess what? He's coming after Lee. And so we're going to see a series of battles here where, Grant will, win some of them. Some of them will be a draw, and he's going to keep pushing forward, wearing out Lee as much as possible. And that's going to start with the Wilderness. The Wilderness campaign, there's about 115,000 Union soldiers and about 65,000 rebel soldiers. And Lee, because he's clearly the smartest general out there, he decides that he wants to draw Grant into a situation where Grant's numbers aren't going to matter as much. And so he draws him into the Wilderness, into a wooded area where, a larger army is not going to be able to have as much of an advantage. And so Lee does draw him into the Wilderness. They end up having it out. The Union casualties end up being about 17,500. The rebel casualties end up being about 7,000. And so that looks like a victory for the South, but it's not. It's not for essentially two reasons. One of those is General Longstreet is going to get shot. And so General Longstreet, Jackson, Stonewall Jackson is dead by this point. And Longstreet is is Lee's right hand man, and the general that he relies on the most. And so the hero of Chancellorsville, and so he's out for the next 5 months. That's going to be devastating to Lee. And the second reason why it's not a win for the South is because Grant doesn't stop coming. It's not that Grant lost and he just headed back to Washington to lick his wounds. No, I mean, yeah, he lost, but he's still pushing forward and he's still pushing at Lee. And so Lee's in a pretty desperate situation here. So we'll go ahead and call the Wilderness essentially a draw here. The next major battle is going to be at Spotsylvania. And so Spotsylvania, this battle, it takes a very long time. Battle is going to last about 2 weeks. And so this battle, there's going to be, again, massive amounts of casualties. We're going to have about 18,000 Union casualties and about 11,000 rebel casualties. And so when they meet at Spotsylvania, they're going to have it out again. The very famous Confederate cavalry general is a guy by the name of Jeb Stuart. He's going to be killed in this battle, taking out another one of these exceptional Southern generals. The North is, at this point, because of the casualties here in Spotsylvania, the North is really starting to be concerned about the number of casualties in this war. I mean, Grant's got the nickname the Butcher, the meat grinder. Essentially, he's, the implication is he's just grinding up his soldiers, and people are concerned about that. But Grant doesn't let that bother him. He says, "This is how we're going to win. We're just going to wear down our opponent." And so he's going to continue to essentially push on, and he's going to push on to Cold Harbor. Cold Harbor is about 10 miles northeast of Richmond. And so, we've got this massive push, right? We got the wilderness, and then we've got Spotsylvania, where we're going to have another serious battle, and then we're driving, continually pushing, trying to get to Richmond, and so we're about 10 miles away from the southern capital, and hopefully the end of the war, and so Grant meets Lee at Cold Harbor, but this is where Grant makes a mistake. Grant has not given Lee a breather yet. He just keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. But at Cold Harbor, Grant believes that his men are too tired, and they're too tired to keep fighting. And so he's going to give them a day off when they get to Cold Harbor. And that one day, you just did what you can never do when you're fighting General Lee, and that's give him time. And so within that one day, Lee's going to have time to entrench himself, and when Grant finally attacks, Lee's going to slaughter Grant's attack. It's just going to be absolutely terrible. And Grant's going to be forced to push back. And so and to leave. And so Cold Harbor ends up being a loss. Grant's this close to getting to Richmond, and he gets defeated by Lee in a pretty serious defeat. And so all of a sudden now, he's got to change tack. And so what he decides to do is to swing around to the other side of Richmond and attack at Petersburg. Petersburg is important because it's on the southern side of Richmond. And so, like, the supplies have been kind of coming into Richmond from the southern side. Richmond's in a whole lot of trouble. There's bread riots in Richmond. They're starving there. So if he can swing around and take Petersburg, which has a pivotal railroad junction that supplies Richmond, he can essentially start to starve Richmond into submission. And plus, then you have that southern route of attack, not just the northern route. And so when he does this, Grant ends up having to lay siege to Petersburg, and so which is 23 miles south. This is essentially going to be the last full engagement that the Confederate Army is going to have before Lee surrenders. So there's going to be some more skirmishes, but this is the last big battle. And so what Grant does is he essentially surrounds Petersburg, and then he learned from Cold Harbor, don't attack Lee when he's entrenched. Don't rush into it anyway. And he essentially waits until Lee's men are starving. And then he lets his engineers do something that's going to it's actually going to be attempted at the Battle of Ypres in World War I too. He's going to give his engineers the go-ahead to essentially dig a tunnel underneath the Confederate defensive line, and then fill that tunnel with dynamite and blow it up. And so they'll do that. There's this huge explosion. And then the idea is you blow up that part of the defensive system, and then you rush your guys through. The problem with that is it just doesn't work. Because when you explode the dirt and you make it all loose, it becomes like muddy. And so when the soldiers try to get across that area, they're essentially going to be mowed down by Lee's men, and so it won't work. It also won't work when the Allies try it in World War I in the Belgium town of Ypres. If you're French, you call it Ypres, but at Ypres. And so it doesn't work. And so, eventually Lee is going to be forced to flee Petersburg because his soldiers are starving. And so he's going to be, he's on his last legs. He's trying to, to salvage as much as he can, but the writing's essentially on the wall. He's just got to figure out how to. And at the same time, General Sherman is going to be ordered to take Atlanta. Atlanta is another one of those very massive railroad junctures. It's one of the few industrial centers in the South. And so when he's tasked with taking Atlanta, he's going to take Atlanta. But remember what we said about Sherman in previous lectures. People thought he was insane because he took this total war idea very, very serious. He doesn't invent the idea of total war, but he's one of its first practitioners, one of the first people to actually do it. And so when he gets to Atlanta, guess what's going to happen to Atlanta? Yeah, it's going to go up like a matchstick. And so, his idea is on his way to Atlanta and through Atlanta, it's to make Georgia howl. He's trying to cause enough pain in the South that the South will stop fighting, right? So he's going to destroy all the homes he comes across. He's going to destroy the fields and make it to where the fields aren't going to be usable again, and it's just going to be a massive swath of destruction. I mean, the South still hates this guy today because of it. And so he'll eventually get to Atlanta. Here's an artist's rendition of what happens at Atlanta. It essentially, they're just, it's, and then once he takes Atlanta, he's going to begin his march to the sea. Does that, he's going to be tearing up all the railroad track that he can find, destroying any trains that he can, and starts to push to Savannah. The idea behind this is to do two things. When he's pushing to Savannah, it's going to cut the Confederacy in half again. We've already cut it in half one time when we captured the Mississippi, but we're going to cut it again. And then this time, where the plan is, he can then move in on General Lee from the opposite direction of Grant. And so you can kind of surround Lee's army. Lee, at this point, since Grant has taken over, has just been retreating and retreating and retreating. And so if Grant is the hammer, pushing at Lee, pushing at Lee, pushing at Lee, well, Lee can just continue retreating because there's nothing to stop him. But if Sherman's there, right, you push Lee into into the anvil, and that can end the war. So this is Sherman's march to the sea. He's going to spread his military out as wide as he can and march from Atlanta all the way down to Savannah, Georgia. He spreads it out wide because he wants to destroy as much area as possible, and let the South know, if you don't quit fighting, excuse me, if you don't quit fighting, this is what's going to happen to you. And it's going to be massively destructive. You can see railroad track getting torn up here. Homes are going to be burned. Farms are going to be burned. And the South is. Sherman will arrive at Savannah just shortly before Christmas, and the city essentially surrenders without a fight. They saw what happened to Atlanta, and so the city ends up catching fire anyway. And Sherman says that this wasn't him; it was just an accident. Who knows what happened? I mean, it was Sherman's history, right? And so, what essentially something a Confederate arsenal explodes, and when that happens, most of the sea burns, which is a shame because Savannah is a historic, beautiful city. Got a great university system there, and it's a shame that it goes up. So, with the fall of Petersburg, the essentially Grant crushes through the defensive. Lee escapes. Richmond is no longer protected. Richmond falls, and so Lee is the only guy. Not he's not the only guy out there. There's a few other Southern generals that are still out there, but Lee's essentially the only hope. And so there's a series of short battles where Lee's continuing to surrender, or continuing to retreat, but eventually they get to Appomattox Courthouse. Lee's soldiers are still willing to fight. They believe that Lee, if anybody can find a way to win, that Lee can. But Lee figures out what I mean. He sees the writing on the wall, and so if he just continues to fight, the only thing that's happening is that more people are going to die, and he doesn't want to be responsible for that. So he decides to essentially surrender and call it quits. They're going to He's going to officially surrender at the McLean House, which is one of those weird things that happens in history. The first Battle of Bull Run was essentially fought on McLean property, and they moved away from that area because there's lots of battles there. They thought they were escaping the war, bought a new home, and then years later, the war is going to end on their property as well. With the not officially, but essentially, the war is going to end with the surrender of Leon on the McLean property. Oh, you can see the house there. So when Lee surrenders, Grant is going to be extremely lenient. He understands that the North is now one, and we're all one country still. And so, if you punish the South too hard, then that's going to not bode well later on. We're all going to have to get along at some point. He also has a tremendous amount of respect for Lee, so he's not going to take any prisoners. Everybody's going to be allowed to turn home. As a matter of fact, after Lee surrenders, the army, the Union Army, when Lee is leaving, officially salutes him, gives him an official salute. I mean, that's how much respect the Union Army had for what Lee was able to do. And so they essentially just are going to let the soldiers go home. There are still some generals out there. Kirby Smith is still fighting. He's going to fight for a little while, but it's over at this point. All right, that is the end of the war and the end of today's lecture. Thank you for your time, and I will see you again shortly.